It's my honor to introduce today lecturer Reverend Dr. David Matsumoto. He's currently the president of the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley, California, and the George and Aratani Professor of Contemporary Shin Buddhist Studies at IBS. He was born in Detroit, Michigan, and raised in St. Paul, Minnesota, where he worked as an attorney at law before taking up the study of Buddhism. He received an MA degree from IBS and an MA and a PhD degrees from Rikoko University in Kyoto, Japan. An ordained Shin Buddhist minister, he served as a Hongwanji Kaikyoshi at the Stockton Buddhist Temple and the Berkeley Buddhist Temple. He has translated and published numerous scholarly and religious writings in the areas that include Shin Buddhist doctrinal studies, narrative theory, comparative theology, and a Shin Buddhist theology of disability. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the mic to Dr. Matsumoto. Today's topic is, what is Mahayana Buddhism and Pure Land Buddhism?
Thank you very much, Dexter. Hello, everyone. Good morning and aloha from Millbrae, California. Nice to see a lot of familiar faces, a lot of old friends. Somehow, with the wonder of technology, we can still spend time together and still share the Dharma together. So I'm very, very grateful. I'd like to thank everyone in the Honpa Hongwanji Mission of Hawaii for inviting me to be with you today. So the topic for today is what is Mahayana Buddhism and what is Pure Land Buddhism? I do have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to share that with you right now. Today's talk will take place in two parts. We'll have part one. We'll respond to the question, what is Mahayana Buddhism? And in part two, we will address the question, what is Pure Land Buddhism? So part one is, what is Mahayana Buddhism? Daijo Bukkyo. I'd like to begin by asking all of you to please join me in Gassho as we hear the words of Shinran Shonin. The true essence of the Pure Land Way, Jodo Shinshu, is the consummation of Mahayana Buddhism. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namanda, Namanda, Namanda. Here we hear Shinran Shonin tell us that the true essence of the Pure Land Way, which is the translation of Jodo Shinshu, is the consummation, the ultimate development, the ultimate evolution of Mahayana Buddhism. So just what is Mahayana Buddhism? We'll begin by looking at the teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha. We're familiar with the Four Noble Truths. Of course, the Four Noble Truths represent the content of Shakyamuni Buddha's first teaching. They also express a fundamental insight that first, suffering and fundamental disease form our samsaric existence. Two, our ignorance, deluded passions, and craving act as the cause of such suffering. Three, nirvana represents the cessation of ignorance, passions, and craving, and thus the emancipation from suffering. And four, there is a path to the attainment of nirvana, the Noble Eightfold Path. This tells us that Buddhism is fundamentally a path. So let's think about that for a little while if we could. First of all, what is the starting point of the path? Buddhism teaches us that the starting point is our realization that we are unenlightened sentient beings. This situation is described in the teachings in a variety of ways. For instance, we are taught that we dwell in endless cycles of samsaric existence, or that our existence is characterized by suffering and disease. We just saw the first noble truth, caused by craving and ego attachment, the second noble truth. Buddhism also describes our current state as one in which we are afflicted with discriminative consciousness. This is a way of saying that our thinking is fundamentally flawed, because In our thinking, we create separations where there are none. We make distinctions between myself and yourself, or young and old, rich and poor, male or female. We make all sorts of distinctions, which are fundamentally false distinctions. And based on those distinctions, we create value judgments. We act in ways that create suffering. This discriminative consciousness is also described as our fundamental ignorance. We just don't get it. We don't understand or see things as they really are. We're also described as foolish beings, bombu, who are burdened with evil karma and afflicted with deluded, burning passions. These are all then descriptions of the starting point of the path. The destination of the path is also described in a variety of ways. It is supreme nirvana, sometimes referred to as the liberation from suffering, or the complete cessation of craving and ego attachment, as we saw in the third noble truth. Also, the destination is described as fundamental non-discriminative wisdom, known in Sanskrit as prajna paramita, in which our false thinking is broken through. We are no longer making false distinctions. We see the non-duality, the oneness of all things. Our destination is also described as perfect enlightenment, also Buddhahood, suchness, oneness, or thusness, emptiness, formlessness, and is generally described as being inconceivable, inexpressible, and inexplicable. It is beyond our ability to understand it, to talk about it, or to explain it. So the question remains then, the nature of the path. And we ask ourselves a question: how can an ignorant being, described in the ways that we have seen, possibly realize enlightenment? What sort of abilities, what sort of tools, what sort of capabilities do we have that would allow us to think that we could possibly realize enlightenment or attain Buddhahood? So Buddhism sets out the model or the scheme of a path. The main pillars of the path we'll talk about now. The first is teaching. That is the teaching of the Buddha, the teaching of the enlightened ones, the teachings of the possibility of attaining enlightenment and the way to enlightenment. Then the practices. What are the ways in which we can put these teachings into practice through, perhaps traditionally through mental activities, through physical activities, through verbal activities. And then realization. The next question is, how do we bring the truth embodied in the teaching to realization? Or maybe stated in another way, how do we actualize the truth embodied in the teaching through practice? So this is sort of the traditional scheme of the path, the way in which ignorant beings can attain enlightenment. Let's go back to early Buddhism, where it was thought that there could only be one Buddha at a particular time. Gautama Buddha, or also known as Shakyamuni Buddha, was recognized as the one Buddha dwelling in the history of this world. As such, practitioners did not aspire to become Buddhas, but rather arhants, who would realize the cessation of craving and ego attachment. However, following the Buddha's entry into parinirvana, many Buddhist schools lapsed into a kind of formalistic monasticism, which emphasized an individual's renunciation from the world. They held out as the religious ideal the arhat, who had overcome passions and crossed over to the realm of nirvana. In addition, a form of elitist scholasticism developed, which moved Buddhist thought toward more conceptualized notions of the self and of attainment. This was accompanied by an abstract and thus inadequate understanding of the tenacity of one's ego attachment and the depth of one's karmic hindrances. And so there arose within the history of Buddhism what we now call Mahayana Buddhism, Daijo Bukkyo. The Mahayana movement arose some 500 years after the death of Shakyamuni in reaction to the prevailing traditions. Critical of the paths of the two vehicles, in which renunciants strove to attain nirvana for themselves only, the Mahayana path offered a new path, a great vehicle, upon which all beings would have the opportunity to attain Buddhahood. Mahayana Buddhism, in other words, was grounded on the principle that all beings have the potential of attaining Buddhahood. Let's talk about some foundational aspects of that path, of the Mahayana Buddhist path. One is that there are infinite Buddhas. That is to say, in Mahayana, there can be more than one Buddha can exist at the same time. It's further conceived that in reality, there can be countless, innumerable Buddhas throughout the universe. That is not just one Buddha, but countless, infinite Buddhas can exist throughout the universe. Another basic feature of the Mahayana path is something called the bodhicitta, the mind that aspires to attain enlightenment. What is that? The bodhicitta is the aspiration to attain complete, perfect enlightenment in order to teach and guide all ignorant, suffering beings to attain Buddhahood as well. Another way of saying that is that the realization of the bodhicitta marks the first step onto the bodhisattva path. That is, a bodhisattva is a being. One becomes a being, a person who seeks bodhi. That's the bodhisattva in the broadest generic sense. One becomes a seeker of bodhi for one's own benefit, but also for the benefit of all unenlightened beings. Another notion inherent in this scheme of the Mahayana Buddhism is that there are stages along the path for the bodhisattva, or in the what we might call the career of the bodhisattva. These are the 10 bodhisattva stages, the Dasha Bhumi. We see at the bottom of the page that there are 40 preliminary stages, the stages of the 10 faiths, 10 abodes, 10 practices, and 10 forms of merit transference. And so a seeker engages in these first preliminary stages, of course, with great diligence and sincerity. But the problem is that in those first 40 stages, the practicer is always in danger of falling back. That for one reason or another, one can always retrogress, to fall back on the path, getting further and further away from one's goal or the destination. So a crucial moment, a crucial stage in the Bodhisattva path is stage 41. That's refers to as the first Bodhisattva stage, when the practitioner actually becomes a Bodhisattva in a greater sense. This stage is also further expressed as one enters the ranks of the truly settled of the Mahayana. It's also called the stage of non-retrogression. From this point on, there's no falling back, only going forward. It's also known as the stage of joy because, of course, one would feel great joy in realizing that one will no longer fall back on the path, that one will only go forward toward complete enlightenment. Then there are a number of other stages on the path. Then crucial to the career of the Bodhisattva is stage 51, which is called the equal of enlightenment, that one is about to become a Buddha, almost there. This is where the Maitreya Bodhisattva is said to dwell in stage 51. And the Maitreya Bodhisattva will become the next Buddha in this realm. And then stage 52 is referred to as complete perfect enlightenment, that is the attainment of Buddhahood. Another important feature in the Mahayana Buddhist path is something called Buddha nature, or Bussho. Buddha nature might be understood to represent the fundamental, essential nature of Buddhahood, as well as the potential for attaining Buddhahood. That is to say, Mahayana thought views Buddha nature as encompassing both the causal seed, that is the potential for Buddhahood that all beings possess, and the effect or the resultant state, the Dharma body, Buddhahood itself. Another key feature of the Mahayana Buddhist path is the Bodhisattva's vows, pranidhana, or gan. These vows are both general, known as the four great universal vows taken by all bodhisattvas, and they are also vows made that are specific to each bodhisattva. These vows essentially provide for the characteristics of the Buddha that the bodhisattva will become, as well as the nature of that Buddha's land and the path by which beings may realize birth in that land. Then, after declaring the vows, the bodhisattva undertakes paramita practices over great innumerable kalpas of time. Another important feature of the bodhisattva path is something called merit transference, or directing of virtue, padinama, or eko. The practice of directing or transferring merit, punya, produced and accumulated by the performance of virtuous deeds, kusala deeds, to a particular person or persons, or to all sentient beings. In Mahayana Buddhism, merit transference is especially accomplished by a bodhisattva for the greater goal of attaining Buddhahood in order to liberate all ignorant beings from suffering and samsara. So in Mahayana Buddhism, merit transference is not just transferred for one's own enlightenment, but for the enlightenment of all ignorant beings. The dedication of merit is also an important element in all Buddhist rituals and meditative practices. Another key feature of the Mahayana Buddhist path, the path of the Bodhisattva, is that of the Buddha land, Buddha Kshetra. Moreover, each Buddha is seen as dwelling within a Buddha land. A Buddha land represented an environment or circumstances in which that Buddha could teach and guide ignorant beings to realize Buddhahood themselves. Let's talk now about some of the foundational teachings of the great vehicle of Mahayana Buddhism. We'll talk about the logic and structure of the Mahayana thought. The Prajnaparamita Sutras, which first arose during the first century of the Common Era, set forth the notion that the Bodhisattva becomes empty through the practice of Prajnaparamita, that is, non-discriminative wisdom. Based on those sutras, Nagarjuna and Aryadeva developed a logical structure for the inseparability and interfusion of existence and non-existence. This gets a little bit difficult to conceive, but let's go through this step by step. In Nagarjuna's text, the Mula Madhyamika Karika, the fundamental verses of the middle way, he reveals that in the doctrine of dependent origination, Praticca Samutpada, which states that things do not come into being and do not disappear, are not impermanent or permanent, are not identical or different, and do not come or go. This is the auspicious doctrine, which effectively brings the conceptualized notion of reality, prapancha, to cessation. This is known as the eightfold negation, in which all possibilities that we normally think of in terms of existence and non-existence are negated. It's not that we come into being, it's not that we disappear. It's not that things are impermanent or impermanent. It's not that things are identical or different, not that things come or go. It just negates all of our aspects of our non-discriminative thinking, our false thinking. The conceptualized notion of reality is brought to cessation. Another way of saying the same thing is in terms of form and emptiness. So there's this very famous passage from the Prajnaparamita in 25,000 lines, which goes like this. Form is not different from emptiness. Emptiness is not different from form. Form is itself emptiness. Emptiness is itself form. Let's try to break down what this might mean. First of all, it states form is emptiness. In Japanese, this is shiki sokuze ku. In other words, discriminative and egocentric thinking have been completely broken through. This is the state what in Buddhism calls no mind. that through learning the teachings, engaging in practices, attaining realization, little by little, gradually along the path, our false thinking, our discriminative, our ego-centered thinking are broken through. What this means is that the subject-object structure of thought and being, that is form, is eradicated and dissolves into infinite nothingness. Our false way of thinking, oh, there's a subject and an object, there's a me, there's a you, there's an us, this is them, making false separations where there are none. This is the basic problem that we have, our fundamental ignorance. But that, now represented by the word form, is eradicated on the path, dissolves into infinite nothingness. So that's a way of understanding form as emptiness. But at the same time, it's also stated that emptiness is form, ku sokuze shiki. What this might mean is that even as false discrimination ends, discrimination based on wisdom and practice still functions. This might be called the mind of no mind, and that non-discriminative wisdom and the object perceived by the wisdom, suchness or reality as it is, are not separate things. That even as one realizes or breaks through our false thinking, then still discrimination continues, or thinking continues, but now this thinking and perception is based on wisdom, okay, no longer on falsity. In other words, another way of using this is to talk about emptiness or void, shunyata. Emptiness is a condition that cannot be comprehended by our false thinking, our discriminative consciousness, or even by its cessation. Empty signifies two aspects of a single reality. It refers to prajna, that is non-dichotomous wisdom, non-discriminative wisdom, or the cutting off of our dichotomous thought, our vikalpa, that is our false thinking, where we make distinctions where there are none. This is prajna. This is the Bodhisattva's contemplative practice of not seeing. Empty also indicates an emptiness, shunya, that is a non-existence of all things discriminated by the ego-centered mind. All this is getting a little difficult, I'm sure. Please bear with me. This is really fundamental to Mahayana Buddhism, and as we'll see, it really forms a basis for Pure Land Buddhism and then for Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. Let's talk about this in another way. Non-discriminative wisdom, that is called not seeing, arises when dichotomous thinking ceases and the subject, the seer, and the object, the seen, become one. Normally, in my conventional way of thinking, there is me, myself, and I who see things, and you or the world or other objects in the world is seen, and I make a distinction between them. I think there is me, there is you, there is myself, there is a tree, there is the subject and the object, and we see them as separate. But in non-discriminative wisdom, we break through that false thinking, and the subject and the object become one. Thus, the Bodhisattva is able to see things just as they are in their absolute particularity. We see the Bodhisattva is able to see each thing just as it is, but also in their non-difference from all things, that they're empty of all inherent self-nature. This is the nature of emptiness. Let's look at this in a different way, okay? We'll look at it in terms of the Mahayana path of practice and realization. The notion of the Mahayana path of practice and realization gained development through the Vijñapti Matrata, the consciousness only or subjectivity only thought of Maitreya, Asanga, and Vasubandhu. In this school of thought, which is also referred to as Yogacara, the idea that form is emptiness does not simply represent an objective logic. Rather, that Madhyamika basic thought also reflects the Bodhisattva's subjective realization of non-duality, resulting from both the eradication of samsara and the attainment of nirvana, and the transformation in which samsara comes into complete identity with nirvana. Again, very confusing language. Let's take a few steps to address this. Yogacara thought sets out the theory of the three natures. That is, it sets out to clarify three dimensions of things as they are experienced and realized by the bodhisattva who has attained non-discriminative wisdom. So as the bodhisattva progresses on the path of the bodhisattva, hears the teachings, engages in practice, attains realization, that bodhisattva comes to experience and realize things. And in that experience with things and others, that is addressed in terms of three dimensions. What are the three? The first is called fulfilled nature. It refers to the real nature of things, emptiness and thusness. The bodhisattva sees things exactly as they are, okay? The oneness, the non-duality, the inseparability of all things. Two, the bodhisattva also sees the other dependent nature. That is to say, it points to the discriminative mind, the seer, which the bodhisattva knows to have arisen from conditions and therefore to exist only provisionally, the seer that exists but does not truly exist. That is to say, the bodhisattva sees beings who still have discriminative thinking, who still make separations where there are none, beings like us who engage in false thinking, and the bodhisattva realizes this, that they continue to exist. This is the other dependent nature that the bodhisattva encounters. And then the third is discriminated nature, refers to the perceived and conceptualized objects of delusory thought, the seen, which the bodhisattva knows to be false, unreal, and non-existent. That is to say, the bodhisattva also realizes that we, ignorant beings who continue to make distinctions where there are none, we can continue to separate out reality. We think we can identify objects or persons or things based on our thought or our perception. The bodhisattva realizes that these objects are really non-existent. So this leads us to an insight in Mahayana Buddhism called subjectivity only. Subjectivity only refers to subjectivity, that is, knowing and seeing, where the subject and object dichotomy has been eradicated. So that is to say, the bodhisattva sees and knows subjects and objects, where the bodhisattva realizes that false separation we make between subject and object, the I and the thou, has been eradicated. This signifies the mind of no mind, in which discriminative thinking is inseparable from non-discriminative thinking. But subjectivity only also means that the bodhisattva is able to grasp reality as itself without objectifying it in any way. Or, that is to say, in this direct, immediate, non-conceptualized, and authentic self-knowledge, both the seer and the seen are known to be non-different. Let's talk about this using different terms, if we could. There's another notion in Mahayana thought talking about three aspects of non-discriminative wisdom that are realized on the bodhisattva path. Okay, as the bodhisattva is engaging in the path that we talked about before, going through the 10 stages of the bodhisattvahood, hearing, learning the teachings, putting them into practice, attaining realization, that in this path, along this path, the bodhisattva realizes non-discriminative wisdom, prajnaparamita, but in three different aspects, okay? The first is something called preparatory non-discriminative wisdom. That is to say, here the bodhisattva has learned about suchness, learned about enlightenment, conceives of the non-duality of all existences, but this is still sort of an intellectual endeavor. There's still this consciousness in which separations are made. So it's still preparatory. The bodhisattva is understanding this, but still not fully realizing it. So the bodhisattva still dwells in the realm of duality and still sees things in terms of the subject-object dichotomy. The second aspect is something called fundamental non-discriminative wisdom. Here the bodhisattva, through teaching, practice, and realization, comes to experience and to realize the realm of non-duality, understanding the non-difference of all things, the breaking through of the subject-object dichotomy. This is also known as the overcoming of all dichotomous thinking. Okay, all of our false thinking is now broken through. But it doesn't end there. The Bodhisattva also then comes to realize something called subsequently attained non-discriminative wisdom. This is also prajnaparamita, fundamental wisdom, but now it is wisdom that is attained beyond fundamental wisdom. What does that mean? The Bodhisattva has realized the oneness of all existences, but now realizes that still beings dwell within duality, and the Bodhisattva is able to, in a sense, return to the realm of duality, but now sees things in a much different way. The Bodhisattva is dwelling within what might be called the realm of the duality of non-duality. Okay, here the perception of particularity, knowing all things just as they are, their uniqueness, but also in their difference, but then still grounded in their oneness with all things and non-dichotomous thinking. So this is perhaps still difficult to understand. So let's use another way of thinking about it. Some of you may be as old as I am. And if you remember back in your youth, there was a singer by the name of Donovan. And Donovan had a song which was very simple. I remember hearing it, didn't know what he was talking about, but he had this very simple melody which went, first there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. I don't know if you remember that. I can't sing it for you, but those are the lyrics. First there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. In many ways, Donovan's song, which I think was based on his experience with Zen, can be a good way of understanding what we're talking about here. This first aspect of preparatory non-discriminative wisdom, which the Bodhisattva sort of understands the non-duality of all things, but still is dwelling in this realm of duality, that might be expressed by the first line. First, there is a mountain. The Bodhisattva is in the world and says, wow, look at that big mountain. It's huge, it's gigantic, it's wonderful. I'd like to go there. I'd like to climb it. And still, the Bodhisattva is seeing that mountain and dwelling within duality, making a separation between oneself and the mountain. But through practice, through teaching, practice, and realization, the Bodhisattva gradually comes to realize the inseparability, the non-duality of self and object, and realizes that one's false thinking is broken through, and now one realizes that there is no mountain. Okay, there's no mountain separate from oneself, and so that sense of emptiness, of non-discriminative wisdom, can be expressed by the next line. Then there is no mountain. Okay, the Bodhisattva realizes the emptiness of one's false thinking, the object of one's false thinking. But the career of the Bodhisattva doesn't end there. The Bodhisattva realizes subsequently attained non-discriminative wisdom. In a sense, the Bodhisattva returns to this world of duality. And now grounded in this fundamental wisdom, non-discriminative wisdom, knows that all things are non-dual, still can dwell within the realm of duality, because that's where ignorant beings dwell. And the Bodhisattva knows ignorant beings still see things as separate. And now the Bodhisattva, although the Bodhisattva knows that that's false thinking, still the Bodhisattva can understand that and recognize it. And so the Bodhisattva can then say, then there is a mountain, but now perceived in a much different way. Okay, not as a reality distinct from oneself, but that's the way it's perceived by ignorant beings. And so the Bodhisattva is active within this world of duality in a way to teach and guide beings to realize fundamental non-discriminative wisdom. So whereas 1 and 2 might be referred to as wisdom of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, number 3 might be referred to as compassion. So, as I mentioned before, this is a very important aspect of the Bodhisattva path. It really has 2 meanings. One is that non-dichotomous wisdom, prajnaparamita, comes to manifest itself as form. that accommodates itself to the capacities of ignorant beings in order to lead them to enlightenment. That is, wisdom manifests itself as compassionate activity. That's the whole nature of a bodhisattva in Mahayana Buddhism. The bodhisattva doesn't just go off to realize wisdom for oneself, but wisdom manifests as compassion. And using the terminology of the three Buddha body theory, which we'll talk about, that is, the body of true reality or suchness, provisionally manifests form as recompense body and transform body in order to perceive unenlightened beings, which it knows to be empty and non-existent, and guide them, knowing them by becoming them to enlightenment. We'll talk about this right now. So the Mahayana notion is that there are three bodies of a Buddha. This is also somewhat confusing because normally when we think of Buddha, we might think of Shakyamuni Buddha, or we might think of Amida Buddha. We don't think in terms of bodies or that a Buddha has three bodies. But this is a very important notion in Mahayana Buddhism. So the notion of three bodies of the Buddha does not indicate the existence of three different enlightened beings. Rather, it posits the idea that every Buddha possesses three bodies. In other words, according to this theory, the concept of Buddha bodies represents the threefold aspect of enlightenment itself. The three Buddha bodies, in a sense, described three dimensions of enlightenment, which are realized upon attaining non-discriminative wisdom. What are the three? Number one is something called Dharma body, or Dharma kaya, or in Japanese, Hoshin. This is true reality itself. We use words like suchness or Dharma nature to describe it. But it's formless reality. It's perceived by and identical with non-discriminative wisdom. It transcends all concepts of subject, object, space, or time. This is the breaking through of our false thinking, the eradication of the subject-object dichotomy. It's the breaking through of our false thinking. It's something that we refer to as formlessness, okay? Suchness itself. It's inconceivable, inexpressible, inexplicable. Buddhahood or enlightenment is also described as enjoyment body. That's number two, Sambhogakaya or Hojing. This is what's sometimes called the fulfilled or recompensed or reward body as well. That is, this arises and manifests enlightenment as a result of the Bodhisattva's practice and the fulfillment of the Bodhisattva vows. This really gets us into Pure Land Buddhism, as we'll see, but we already talked on the Mahayana path that as Bodhisattva makes vows and engages in practice in order to fulfill those vows. And when those vows are fulfilled, that Bodhisattva becomes the fulfilled Buddha body, the enjoyment body, Sambhogakaya. Buddhahood is also described in the third way as transformed body or bodies, Nirmanakaya or Keshin, also referred to as accommodated or provisional body. This is true in which true reality enters into history as a temporary body of transformation in a manner that is accommodated to the capacities of ignorant beings so as to lead them to enlightenment. This we know in our experience as Shakyamuni Buddha. So merit transference takes on a very important form, but it also is described and, in a sense, explained by this Mahayana logic, the Mahayana practice and realization. So a key element of the Mahayana Bodhisattva path, the concept of merit transference, is grounded in the complex logic of Mahayana Buddhism. Sentient beings are, for the Bodhisattva, subjectivity that has appeared as form. As we have seen, this means that the Bodhisattva is able to, one, know oneself without falsely objectifying oneself, and know beings by becoming them. Because the Bodhisattva knows that one is distinct from and yet identical with all beings, the Bodhisattva's practice of prajna paramita, non-discriminative wisdom, naturally results in self-benefit and benefit to others. So this logic supports the possibility and the efficacy of merit transference, that the Bodhisattva, realizing the non-distinction between oneself and others, is able to engage in practice and realize wisdom for the benefit of oneself and all others. There's no separation between the two. We all can talk about the structure of attainment in Mahayana thought, okay? The Bodhisattva path has two contradictory aspects. That is to say, samsara and nirvana stand in mutually exclusive opposition to each other. This is sort of how we traditionally understand it. We dwell in the realm of samsara, and nirvana is the cessation of delusion and craving, and thus we are emancipated from suffering. That's nirvana, where they're said to stand separate, opposite each other, mutually exclusive. In this sense, the dichotomy between the two is seen. Nirvana is attained only by negating and transcending samsara. This is normally how we think of it, right? One must eliminate blind passions and false discrimination to attain enlightenment. Mahayana has that understanding, but it also goes beyond that. It also realizes, and yet, the very dichotomy of samsara and nirvana is also eradicated. Upon attaining wisdom, the Bodhisattva returns to this world. That is to say, so the Bodhisattva, having overcome false distinction, all false distinctions, also eradicates the false distinction between samsara and nirvana. And so using this sort of thinking, the Bodhisattva career then is described as the Bodhisattva returns to this world. Here we have phrases such as nirvana of no abiding place. The Bodhisattva who has attained non-discriminative wisdom has no attachment to samsara or nirvana. The Bodhisattva neither dwells in nirvana nor abandons samsara. One is not bound by samsara or nirvana. That's the nature of Mahayana Bodhisattvahood. This is something we understand in this term, in the Mahayana understanding of samsara and nirvana, shoji sokunehan. It goes like this: samsara is nirvana. Here we see a path from samsara to nirvana lies in one irreversible direction when viewed from the perspective of the practitioner on the path. Here we see the diagram. On the left-hand side that's us. We are unenlightened beings, and we undertake this path of teaching, practice, and realization to cross over to the other shore, to go from samsara to nirvana in that direction. That's the notion of samsara is nirvana. So the path is a long and gradual process of transformation upon which ignorance and craving that bind us to samsaric existence are eliminated through practice. That's sort of the traditional notion of Buddhism, which is common to most schools of Buddhism. But Mahayana Buddhism also recognizes that nirvana is samsara. That is to say, at the same time, the path itself is non-dual and not unidirectional when viewed from the perspective of true reality. That is to say, here we have a diagram in which the arrow, it goes in the opposite direction. It's not the green arrow going from ignorance to enlightenment. It's a blue arrow, as I've indicated here, traversing from enlightenment to ignorance. Okay, that's the notion of nirvana is samsara. At the same time, okay, the path that is on the path, attainment is identical with each step along the path. Every time false discrimination is eliminated, true reality is manifesting itself. Thus, each step of the path is identical with ultimate realization. This also can be seen in the Mahayana notion of Tathagata. Many of us are aware of the word Tathagata as a synonym for Buddha. Okay, let's break down the word Tathagata. Tathagata consists of certain elements. One is the root tata or nyo, which indicates suchness, supreme nirvana, or thusness, that is the destination of the path. Gata is the past perfect of the word go, that is, has gone. Agata is the past perfect of the word come, to has come. And so Tathagata, when we combine these elements, can be seen in sort of a twofold significance. One is Tathagata is a combination of tata and gata, that is, has gone to suchness, the thus gone, Japanese known as nyoko, that is one who has gone to suchness. Here again, you can see the green line going in the direction from ignorance to enlightenment. One has gone to suchness. That is the notion of Tathagata, one who has realized enlightenment. But Tathagata also is a combination of the elements tata and agata, that is, the thus come, nyorai, one who has come from suchness. Here we see the motion, the direction from enlightenment to ignorance. That's also Tathagata. So Tathagata is both one who has gone to suchness and at the same time, one who has come from suchness. And that's the basic Mahayana notion of Buddhahood. Okay. Finally, in this section of Mahayana Buddhism, I just want to talk about one other theory. That's the theory of the Dharma ages. Here, the notion is sort of an application of history, or sort of the idea of historical process being applied to the Buddhist tradition. Or another way of looking at it is it's a theory in which we look at the Buddhist tradition, the Buddhist history, from the standpoint of sort of historical process. So the Dharma ages starts out with the idea of the right Dharma age, that is the time immediately after the death or the parinirvana of Shakyamuni Buddha. And this period extends for some 500 years, it said. And during this period of time, the true teaching, the practice, and realization continue to exist. In many ways, this makes sense that Shakyamuni Buddha, Gautama Buddha taught people during his lifetime, and after the Buddha's death. There were still some immediate disciples who were able to teach the Dharma, guide beings in the practice of the Dharma, and bring people to realize the truth of the Dharma. So the same for 500 years period, that sort of momentum of the Buddha's practice and insight and enlightenment continued on. But after 500 years, things began to change. This is what's called the semblance Dharma age, which goes on for a 1,000-year period in which only true teaching and practice remain. Here, semblance means it looks like Buddhism, it sounds like Buddhism, it quacks like Buddhism, but it's not really Buddhism. That is to say, the teachings remain, people are able to engage in practice, but no one attains true realization. No one really is able to actualize the truth embodied in the teachings. So it's still the semblance, the appearance of Buddhism only. And finally, the last Dharma age goes on for the next 10,000 years, in which Buddhist path degenerate to such an extent that only true teaching remains. Okay, there's only the teaching. No one engages in true practice, let alone attains realization. And so this is known as the last Dharma age, or in Japanese, Mappo. And Shinran Shonin and many of the great Pure Land scholars calculated that we are now in the midst of the age of Mappo, which only the teaching remains, and especially the teaching of the Pure Land way, Pure Land Buddhism. There's another age that follows it, in which it's the extinction of the Dharma. That is, there's not even any Dharma or Buddhist teachings involved. So this is the theory of the Dharma ages, one that's taken up throughout Buddhist traditions, but really given great emphasis and thought in Pure Land Buddhism. So we're now going to take, we've reached the end of part 1 of Mahayana Buddhism, and I'd like to ask all of you to please join me in Gassho. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namanda, Namanda. Thank you very much. This is the end of part 1. What is Mahayana Buddhism? We're going to take a break right now, so let's get some refreshment and some get our energy renewed, and I'll see you very soon as we begin part 2. Thank you very much. Hello again, welcome back. I hope you had a nice break, that you're all refreshed and ready to get into part 2 of today's talk. In part 2, we're going to take up the question of what is Pure Land Buddhism. So what is Pure Land Buddhism, or known in Japanese as Jodo Kyo? Looking at the history of Buddhism, especially Mahayana Buddhism now, from a historical stance, we can look at two streams developed in Indian Buddhism. One centered on renunciant monks, and another centered on lay householders. And these two streams eventually flowed into China, Korea, and Japan. Of the two, renunciant Buddhism was considered to be superior, since it taught practitioners to adopt the renunciant lifestyle of Gautama Buddha, that is, to leave their homes, to seriously perform practices, to cultivate their minds, realize wisdom and awakening, and realize attainment in the midst of this life and in this present body. This kind of renunciant-centered approach would later come to be called the teaching of the path of sages. In contrast, another stream of Buddhism focused on lay householders, persons who worshipped at the stupas, which enshrined the remains of Gautama Buddha, for it allowed them to continuously call to mind his virtues and extol his character. This understanding then became widespread among lay householders, people who continued to dwell in worldly life, who humbly engaged in farming and trade, and who worked diligently in everyday life while enmeshed in all sorts of ego attachment. Theirs was not the path of the bodhisattva, in the sense of having to renounce their homes and families and perform challenging practices such as the paramita, like the great sages of old, or even like the Buddha himself. It never occurred to them that they should be able to look upon Gautama Buddha as their predecessor, or even to follow in his footsteps. Instead, they came to see Gautama Buddha as truth or substance itself, which came from beyond and appeared in this world in order to teach and guide them. They came to think of Gautama as their savior, who actively approached this world in order to save them. This stream of householder Buddhism was also transmitted through India, China, Korea, and Japan, and later came to be called the Pure Land teachings or Pure Land Buddhism. It is believed that this approach to the Buddhist teachings, that is, the idea of Amida Buddha in particular, arose around the 1st century of the Common Era, approximately 400 to 500 years after the death of Gautama Buddha, at around the same time as the arising of Mahayana Buddhism itself. The collected works of Shinran in the 2nd volume give this explanation of the Pure Land teaching, Jodo Kyo. It states, the Jodo, or the Pure Land Buddhist tradition, has its beginning in 3 Mahayana sutras, the larger sutra of immeasurable life, the smaller sutra of immeasurable life, and the contemplation sutra. And the Pure Land practices such as invoking the name of Amida or contemplating the features of the Buddha land have been commonly employed in various schools of East Asian Buddhism. Pure Land Buddhism also, it's very much Mahayanistic. And this is with a point that I want to make in part 2, is that Pure Land Buddhism is very much Mahayana Buddhism. It's really based upon the fundamental spirit of Mahayana Buddhism, that is, all beings have the potential, the opportunity to attain enlightenment. Okay, that fundamental spirit, that fundamental sort of focus of Mahayana Buddhism is very much the focus of Pure Land Buddhism. And so many elements are held in common, but Pure Land Buddhism in many ways takes Mahayana to a greater and a more practical degree. So once again, we talked about the Mahayana notion of the 3 bodies of the Buddha. Pure Land Buddhism really focuses on the second of the bodies, the enjoyment body, or the Sambhogakaya. That is to say, the enjoyment body arises and manifests true enlightenment as a result of the Bodhisattva's practice and fulfillment of the Bodhisattva's vows. In this sense, this body is said to enjoy the fulfillment of those vows and practices. thereby being adorned with special features set out in the vows. So sometimes the Bodhisattva might say, when I become a Buddha, I'll become this kind of Buddha. I will have these features. I will have this kind of light. I will be able to guide beings in this way. And so when that Bodhisattva fulfills those vows through practice, the Bodhisattva is able to enjoy the consequence, the fulfillment of those vows. As part of that, the fulfillment body, the Bodhisattva establishes a Buddha land, or a realm, a field of influence in which to act to help bring beings to realize nirvana. And in this Buddha body is a dimension of enlightenment that represents the interface of time and timelessness, of form and formlessness. So these are features we saw in our discussion of Mahayana Buddhism, and Pure Land Buddhism also adopts them. Once again, we talked about the Buddha land. Each Buddha is seen as dwelling in the Buddha land. This Buddha land represents an environment or circumstances in which that Buddha could teach and guide ignorant beings to realize Buddhahood themselves. But just as we saw in Mahayana Buddhism, there was the notion, the realization there could be infinite Buddhas. Likewise, the realization there could be infinite Buddha lands, many, many Buddha lands. There are a number of Buddhas mentioned in the Mahayana Sutras, quite a few. Here are just 3 of the many sutras mentioned. There is Akshobhya Buddha, who is said to dwell in the Buddha field Abhirati in the eastern direction. There is also the Tathagata Vaisajya Guru, Yakushi Nyorai in Japanese, the medicine Buddha, whose realm is also in the east. And of course, in the very famous Amitabha or Amitayus Buddha, the Buddha of immeasurable light and life, whose Pure Land is in the western direction. And there are a number of other Buddhas mentioned in the sutras. Of the innumerable Buddhas, for the most part, it was the Buddha of immeasurable life, Amitayus, and immeasurable light, Amitabha, that captured the interest of practitioners. Over 210 Mahayana Sutras make some mention of this Buddha, Amitayus, Amitabha, and of the Buddha's land of utmost bliss, Skavati. These Pure Land Sutras, as they've come to be known, describe the sublime and ideal beauty of that land, as well as the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas of that land. Both the Amida Buddha and the Buddha's land, declared Shinran Shonin, correspond to the fulfilled body, or Sambhogakaya. And among the scriptures, the 3 Pure Land Sutras provide detailed descriptions of and focus on Amida Buddha and that Buddha's land of utmost bliss. Here's some examples. In the larger Skavati Sutra, it states, it's very long, I won't go through the whole thing, but it's very beautiful. It says, further, the Bodhi tree of the Buddha of immeasurable life is 4 million miles in height, very tall tree, with a girth at its base of 50 yojanas. Its branches and leaves spread 200,000 miles in the 4 directions. It is formed naturally of a composite of all kinds of gems. These are very typical of the descriptions of the land, of the Buddha Pure Land in the Mahayana Sutras, especially the larger sutra. Here's other examples. This is from the Contemplation Sutra, which instructs practitioners to engage in a range of contemplations. This is from the 9th contemplation, talking about the Buddha. Next, envision the physical characteristics and the light of Amitayus. Ananda, you should realize that his body is as glorious as 1,000 million kotis of nuggets of gold from the Jambu River of the Yama heaven, that his height is 600,000 kotis of nayutas of yojanas, multiplied by the number of sands of the Ganges, the river Ganges. The white tuft of hair curling to the right between his eyebrows is 5 times as big as Mount Sumeru. His eyes are clear and as broad as the 4 great oceans. Their blue irises and white are distinct. So these are really some of the really fantastic, beautiful, amazing descriptions here of Amida Buddha. And the 3rd Pure Land Sutra, we know of the Amida Sutra, also states this. So, for instance, here we say, Shariputra, why is this land called utmost bliss? Because beings there suffer no pain and only enjoy pleasures of various kinds. Again, Shariputra, in the land of utmost bliss, there are 7 rows of balustrades, 7 rows of decorated nets, and 7 rows of trees. Okay, and then it goes on to talk about the Buddha. Why do you think that Buddha is called Amitabha? Shariputra, the Buddha's light shines boundlessly and without hindrance over all the worlds and the 10 directions. Okay, so these are some of the really wonderful descriptions of the Pure Land, the Buddha, and there are also descriptions of the Bodhisattvas in these Pure Land sutras. So of all the sutras, let's take a look at what we're calling the fundamental narrative of Pure Land Buddhism. This is the story of Pure Land Buddhism, and it's really told in the largest sutra of immeasurable life, the largest Skavati Vyuha Sutra. It goes like this. In the larger sutra of immeasurable life, Shakyamuni Buddha tells us of the Bodhisattva Dharmakara, who aspired to attain Buddhahood in order to bring all beings to that same enlightenment. Again, that's the aspiration of the Mahayana Bodhisattva. Under the guidance of Lokeshvara Raja Buddha, he viewed every Buddha land, again, countless Buddha lands, and selected the most superlative features from them all. And as you can tell, there are many, many superlative features. He proclaimed 48 great vows to bring all beings to birth in his wondrous land and thereby enable them to attain the highest truth. So I'm sure many of you heard about the 48 vows of the Bodhisattva. These are the vows made, the Bodhisattva made to become a certain kind of Buddha, to create a certain kind of land, and to bring all beings to birth in that land to enable them to attain Buddhahood. Each of the 48 Bodhisattva vows was expressed in this form. If when I attain Buddhahood, something, something, something should not occur, then I shall not attain the highest enlightenment. This double negative is sort of the form we see in the vows. The double negative means something very, very positive. It's a vow. The Bodhisattva says, I will attain Buddhahood and this will occur. This is the way I vow this to occur, basically, in a positive sense. Each of these vows was a manifestation of the essence of Mahayana wisdom and compassion. We've talked about that before, of the Bodhisattva's attainment of prajnaparamita, non-discriminative wisdom, not only for oneself, but for all others, and that this wisdom manifests as compassion. Okay, so these vows are the linguistic expressions of the practice of prajnaparamita, in which acts leading to self-benefit, individual enlightenment, are inseparable from acts bringing benefit to others, universal enlightenment. The Bodhisattva then engaged in practices over endless eons of time and attained perfect enlightenment, becoming the Sambhogakaya Buddha, that body of the Buddha of immeasurable light, Amitabha, and life, Amitayus, creating a Buddha, a pure realm of peace and bliss, Skavati, where beings could practice the way to Buddhahood, thus attaining a path for birth for all beings. Again, fulfilling the promise, the spirit, the inspiration of Mahayana Buddhism, that all beings can attain enlightenment. So this is the scheme that we can see in traditional Pure Land Buddhism. If we start on the far left, this is us, our unenlightened beings. We live in this world, in this life. And it said we engage in this life. It's impossible for us to attain enlightenment as we are. We are not renunciants. We still live in this world in the midst of everyday life. And so it's important at the moment of death that one is reborn into a Buddha land, into here the Buddha land of Amida Buddha. And this Buddha land was created by the fulfillment of the Bodhisattva's vows and practices, that is a Sambhogakaya, presided over by a Buddha who preaches the Dharma and guides beings in the performance of Bodhisattva practices, and that beings attain birth in another life and eventually realize supreme nirvana. So through birth in this land, one is able then to hear the Buddha's teaching, be guided by the Buddha in practice, and eventually reach the highest stage of Buddhahood, thereby attaining enlightenment. That's the traditional scheme of Pure Land Buddhism. Or using other terminology, again, starting on the left-hand side, we dwell in this realm, this world, this life. The big question is, how does one attain birth in the next life? Is it through practice? Is it through faith? How is it that we're able to be reborn in the Buddha land at the moment of death? Furthermore, in the tradition of Pure Land scheme, birth in the Pure Land is described in this way, that one attains entry into the ranks of true settlement. We saw that earlier in terms of the Bodhisattva ranks, the 41st stage. This is the stage of non-retrogression. Once again, that's the nature of the first Bodhisattva stage. One reaches the necessary attainment enlightenment, or later on, we see where Shinran describes this as the stage of the equal of complete enlightenment. But in any event, birth in the Buddha land means that one becomes a bodhisattva in that sort of higher form, that one reaches the 41st stage, the ranks of true settlement, the stage of non-retrogression, and eventually over time, over births and rebirths, one realizes the stage of the equal to the complete enlightenment, the 51st stage, and eventually the 52nd stage of complete enlightenment. That's the Pure Land scheme. There are various Pure Land teachers and masters, various communities arose among many Buddhist schools. Some of the Pure Land teachers, among the many, were persons like Hui Yang of Mount Lu, Hui Yang of Jinying, the Master Zhi Yi of the Tiantai school, the Master Jizang, Fa Chao, and then those are all in China, and there are many, many more in China and Korea, and many Pure Land masters or teachers in Japan, including Saicho, who is known as the founder of Japanese Tendai, but he also had a very strong Pure Land elements in his teaching. Ennin, Ryonin, and Kakuban were among other great Japanese Buddhist masters who taught about Pure Land Buddhism. So Pure Land Buddhism was very extensive, and the teachings were found in many different schools and many different sanghas. That is to say, there are many practitioners, scholar priests, and masters in Mahayana, and also Vajrayana, the more esoteric, or even Tibetan Buddhism has a very strong element of Pure Land in it. So let's go back to the larger sutra and talk about what's important in that sutra. Chief among the 48 vows of the Bodhisattva Dharmakara, many people would point to the 18th vow. It's been called the King of Vows, the original vow, or the primal vow, the Hongan. And it states, this is an edited fashion, if when I attain Buddhahood, the sentient beings of the 10 quarters, that is all throughout the cosmos, with sincere mind, entrusting themselves in aspiring to be born in my land, a threefold mind, and even practicing 10 nen, we'll talk about what this means, should not be born there, may I not attain the supreme enlightenment. There's that double negative, okay? Excluded are those who commit the 5 grave offenses and those who slander the right dharma. This is the 18th vow, the King of Vows, the original or the primal vow. This was considered by many, many Pure Land teachers and masters to be the central, most important of the 48 vows. That is to say, it states, if a sentient being performs the practice of nen, even as few as 10 times, with sincerity and trusting and a desire to be born in that land, then birth will be attained. The double negative becomes a very strong positive. Or stated very simply, the practice leading to birth in the 18th vow is the practice of nen. So what is nen? Here we talk about then Pure Land practice and attainment. The practice of nen, or what we know as nen butsu, was said to enable a practitioner to attain the assurance that one will be born in Amida Buddha's land, Pure Land, in the life to come. So here's the kanji for nen butsu. You see it's a combination, or what we know as nem butsu is a combination of nen plus butsu, or in Chinese, nyan plus fo, or in Sanskrit, buddhamus smrti, which means a variety of things. The nen has as a fundamental meaning thinking, or contemplating, or mindfulness. Buddha is Buddha, okay? So to think on, to contemplate, but also to visualize the Buddha. That's the meaning of Nembutsu. And it also came to be known and to signify to recite the Buddha's name, to invoke the name of the Buddha. So all of this is Nenbutsu. And as we're about to see, that basic idea of Nenbutsu practice, it changed over a course of time. It developed and evolved over a course of time. And Shinran Shonin, again, there are many Pure Land masters in teaching many lineages, but Shinran Shonin identified a particular Pure Land lineage, which he considered to be the most important. He named them the 7 Pure Land masters. They were Nagarjuna and Vasubandhu of India, Tanwan Daocho and Shandao of China, and Genshin and Honen from Japan. And Shinran considered 3 factors in his selection of the 7 masters. That is, 1, each aspired for birth in the Pure Land. They're Pure Land practitioners. They aspired to be born there. Each left writings related to the primal vow and the Nembutsu. So they were very much focused on the 18th vow and the practice of Nenbutsu. And each made a distinguished contribution to the development of the Nembutsu teaching. So each were very important in their presentation, their innovation in their teachings. Let's go through the 7 masters very quickly. The first is Nagarjuna, also known as Gyuju, in 2nd and 3rd century India. His text that is given most attention in the Pure Land school is his commentary on the 10 Bodhisattva stages. Okay, the Dasha Bhumika that we looked at before is set out in the Avatamsaka Sutra. In the chapter on the easy practice of his text, he sets forth 2 ways to attain the first Bodhisattva stage. That is, remember, the 41st stage, the stage of non-retrogression. He says, first, there's a difficult path that he likens to traveling by foot over land, and the easy path, which is like traveling by a boat over water. Nagarjuna describes this system of practice, the easy path, as the easy practice of entrusting as a means. As we look at his text to see what this easy practice includes, it includes such things as thinking deeply on the Buddhas of the 10 quarters, Okunen, reciting their names and praise, Nenbutsu, relying on the Buddha's vows, desiring to be born in the pure Buddha land, where defiled karma will be transformed into virtue, and mindfulness, deep reflection, and contemplation on the character of each Buddha and Bodhisattva. So we see for Nagarjuna, Nen or Nenbutsu has a variety of meanings and features. We now go to Vasubandhu. We saw his name appear, and his Nagarjuna and Vasubandhu's names appear earlier in our discussion of Mahayana Buddhism. Instead of his other well-known Yogacara texts, Honen and Shinran considered Vasubandhu's seminal Pure Land text to be a different one, his discourse on the Sutra of Eternal Life and Gatha of Aspiration to be born in the Pure Land, known as the Treatise on the Pure Land or the Jodo Ron. In that text, Vasubandhu sets out a method of contemplation through which the Bodhisattva will be able to see the Buddha, give rise to a pure mind of faith, and attain birth. This he calls the 5 gates of mindfulness, the Gonen Mon. Here again, Nen appears. They comprise worship, which is a physical activity, praise, which is a verbal activity, aspiration to be born, a mental activity, which is equivalent of shamatha practices of concentration, of contemplation, another mental activity here corresponding with vipassana practices, and merit transference. So these 5 aspects or 5 pillars of this method of practice, the 5 gates of mindfulness, for Vasubandhu, that's what is the meaning of Nenbutsu. A Chinese master, Tan Wan, known as Donran, who lived in the 5th and 6th centuries, further developed this notion of Nenbutsu. Okay, according to legend, he was a Taoist who burned his texts upon meeting Bodhi-Ruchi, and he turned to the Pure Land teachings. He also was a Madhyamika scholar, and he developed a synthesis between Madhyamika and Yogacara thought. And it's believed this synthesis led to the development of the theoretical foundation for Pure Land thought. It's his text, the commentary on the Treatise of the Pure Land, that is his commentary on Vasubandhu's text, that he sets out this notion of Pure Land thought and practice. He interprets Vasubandhu's 5 gates of mindfulness from the standpoint of the vows of Amida Buddha. Okay. That is to say, he also distinguishes self-power practices, which are based on human virtues and efforts, from other power practices, which are based in Amida's fulfilled virtues. He says, because self-power arises from one's own mind of self-attachment and discriminative thinking, the practicer runs the risk of deepening and not eliminating one's deluded attachments. On the other hand, he says, other power arises from the fulfilled vows of Amida, which are the decisive causes of attainment of the 5 gates of mindfulness. So in other words, what Tanwan is doing is he takes up this method of practice set out by Vasubandhu, the 5 gates of mindfulness, and he sort of looks at it from a totally different angle, not from the perspective of one who is doing those practices, but from the perspective of the Bodhisattva, in particular the Bodhisattva Dharmakara, who engage in those practices for the benefit of the self, but for all of us as well, for all of us. So Tanwan's approach to Nen is multifaceted. It encompasses worship, praise, aspiration, contemplation, and merit transference. He also looks at Nen as recitation of the name, as well as contemplation, meditation. So for Tanwan, these practices are important, but he also looks at Nen from a lot of different standpoints, being both recitation and contemplation. The next Chinese master to look at is Dao Cho, or we know also as Do Shaku, who lived in the 6th and centuries in China. He was a student of and lecturer on the Nirvana Sutra, one of the great Mahayana sutras, and he became the heir to Tanwan's Pure Land teaching. His major text was called Passages on the Land of Happiness. It brought further development to notions of Pure Land practice and realization. So based on Nagarjuna's and Tanwan's classification, Dao Cho divided all Buddhist teachings into one, the path of sages that we talked about earlier, which guides beings to the attainment of enlightenment in this life through self-powered practices, and the Pure Land path, which guides beings to attainment in the Pure Land in the next life through other power. Dao Cho also presents a characterization of Amida Buddha as the fulfilled body, the enjoyment body, the Sambhogakaya, as we saw, that has arisen as a result of the fulfillment of the Bodhisattva vows and practices. So his insight is Amida Buddha is Sambhogakaya, the enjoyment body, the fulfilled body of the Buddha. Dao Cho's perspective on Nembutsu was also sort of complex. He saw Nembutsu as both contemplating the Buddha and the Buddha's land, but also reciting the Buddha's name. He says, however, when it really gets down to it, all beings should recite the name. And he himself, even as a great Buddhist master, he realized that in this life, in this world, it's important to recite the name of Amida Buddha. And it said he recited the name many times. He is said to have introduced the string of beads, the Juzu, to Nembutsu practice. And it said he uttered the name 70,000 times a day. The next Chinese master is Shan Dao. We know him as Zendo. He lived in the 7th century in China. He received the teaching of the Pure Land teachings and practices directly from Dao Cho, but he is credited with bringing Pure Land Buddhism to its highest development in China. He stated, for instance, the concept of the ordinary foolish being, the Bombu of heavy karma, for whom the Buddhist path, the Pure Land path, is the only way to true attainment. For us, we are foolish beings. The only way to realize Buddhahood is through the Pure Land path, he said. And Amida Buddha is the recompense Buddha, and the land is a recompense land into which all beings, even the lowest of the low, can be born. And that the evolution of Nembutsu from a contemplative practice to a purely recitative act. Shandao introduced another scheme of Pure Land practices, which he calls the 5 right practices, which include reading the sutras, contemplation, worship, saying the name, and praising and making offerings, And Shandao says, of these 5 practices, number 4, the recitation of the Nembutsu, is the act that brings about true settlement of birth because it is prescribed in the Buddha's primal vow, the 18th vow. So he says, the central practice for Pure Land Buddhists is to say the name of Amida Buddha. Now we move into Japan. We have the master Genshin, also known as Eshin. He lived in the 10th and 11th centuries in Japan. His major text, the Ojo Yoshu, or Essentials for Attaining Birth, was very, very well known. In it, he presented vivid descriptions of the 6 realms of samsaric existence, especially the realm of hell was most well known. He is teaching of the two kinds of pure lands. He says there's a recompense land into which the practicer of the true Nembutsu is born, and transformed land in which persons of miscellaneous and sundry practices will be born. He also presents a very comprehensive discussion of levels of Nembutsu practice. He talks about the teaching of salvation through the great compassion of Amida Buddha, whereby the Buddha's light illumines all beings, grasping them, never abandoning them. So even extending out even further this sense of the great breadth and inclusiveness of Amida Buddha's vows, Amida Buddha's light and name. Genshin is also noted for emphasizing the importance of deathbed Nembutsu practices. He described the rituals and the practices of deathbed Nembutsu, stressing the importance of being in the company of friends who would help the dying person to maintain concentration and practice. And by maintaining focus until the last breath, Genshin says, the practitioner would be assured of birth in the land, Pure Land in the life to come. So for Genshin and many Pure Land Buddhists, what was very essential, really important, was to be saying the Nembutsu at the moment of death. Because by having that practice, having the Nembutsu on one's lips at the moment of death, that in the next instant one will be born in the Pure Land. So Genshin taught that a vocalized Nembutsu is a means to develop a higher contemplative practices, but he also said from his own standpoint, he said he knew his own limitations, and therefore he, Genshin, relied on saying the Nembutsu. Honen, as we know, is also known as Genku. He lived in the 12th and 13th centuries in Japan. He was Shinran's immediate teacher, Shinran's revered master. Honen is said learned of the teachings of Shandao, and from that he had, in a sense, a conversion experience as he inherited the teaching of Shandao, which says, just say the name, single-heartedly say the name of Amida Buddha, whether walking, standing, sitting, or reclining. It doesn't matter how long you say it. It doesn't matter when you say it. Just say it. Just say the name. This is the act of true settlement, for it's in accord with the Buddha's vow. And Honen, who was a Tendai priest, left the mountain of Mount Hiei and set out to establish the Pure Land School of Buddhism, Jodo Shu, as an independent school. He taught the Nen practice, that is, Nenbutsu, was saying the name. This is the sole practice which brings about the assurance of birth in the Pure Land. And so his teaching was just say the name, Senju Nembutsu, exclusive practice of the Nembutsu. And he placed a great emphasis on selection, that is to say, Amida Buddha, the Dharmakara, selected this practice for us. It's the easiest practice because it can be performed by anyone, anywhere, at any time. And it's a superior practice because the name is the embodiment of Amida's virtues and is thus capable of bringing the lowest evildoer to birth. So Honen really emphasized this, the Nembutsu practice, okay, is the easiest and the most superior of all practices because it can be performed by anyone, anytime, no matter who we are, even if we're the lowest of the low. And so extending this sense of the possibility of enlightenment to all people. Honen was a complex person. He appeared to advocate the total rejection of all self-powered practices. He also seemed to have raised doubts as to whether or not The bodhicitta is even essential for in the practice of for the Nembutsu practicer, and he even brought into question the efficacy of merit transference. But he was very resolute. So just say the name. That's all that's required. Now, having said that, that brought him into certain conflicts with both authorities, religious authorities, and secular authorities. But he maintained that it was important to say the name. But he also said it's important to entrust in the vow, okay, of Amida Buddha. He urged Nembutsu practitioners to seek to maintain the proper attitude, recite the name at the moment of death, just as Genshin had stated, in order to assure of their birth in the Pure Land of Amida Buddha in the life to come. So as I mentioned, unfortunately, his legacy was, in a sense, brought into question by political and religious authorities, but there were also many sort of different opinions that were raised by his followers as well after his death. And so this brings us to Shinran, and Shinran's, again, his perspective that we started out with, that the true essence of the Pure Land Way, Jodo Shinshu, is the consummation of Mahayana Buddhism, which is to say that Pure Land Buddhism, the true teaching of Pure Land Buddhism, of saying the Nembutsu and trusting in the vow of Amida Buddha, of being carried to birth through the vow, that's the ultimate development of Mahayana Buddhism. That is how Mahayana Buddhism is able to fulfill its wish and aspiration that all beings will be able to attain enlightenment. This is a subject that my colleagues in subsequent lectures will focus upon. There's a whole wonderful roster of wonderful ministers and scholars who will be speaking to you about the teachings of Shinran Shonin, and I'm sure each and every one of them will focus on this wonderful teaching of Jodo Shinshu, the teaching that all beings can be brought to birth into Pure Land. Let me just, if I may, just give a couple of thoughts just as I bring this talk to conclusion. I believe what we can say is that Shinran Shonin teaches us to know that Pure Land developments of thought and practice were grounded completely in the foundational structures of Mahayana thought. The destination of the true Pure Land path, expressed in Mahayanistic terms, is the awakened self-awareness of the activity of wisdom, compassion in this world of samsara. The true reality, which is dynamic and active, realizes itself as each existing thing. Even as it transcends all conceptualization, it manifests itself as form, as Buddha, Dharma, and skillful means to lead all beings to enlightenment. Let me explain a little bit what I mean by this. I won't tread too much on Shinran because, again, my colleagues will be talking about him specifically. But I believe Shinran looked at the notion of Buddha bodies, both in the threefold form, but also in another way of the two Buddha bodies. He looked at the teachings of Tanwan to declare another Buddha body theory. That is to say, there is Buddha, the Buddha body consists of both the Buddha body of suchness, which he calls Hosho Hoshin. Shinran describes it as neither color nor form, thus the mind cannot grasp it, nor words describe it. So this is formlessness that we talked about in Mahayana Buddhism. But he also says Dharma body as compassionate means, the Hoben Hoshin. From this oneness was manifested form called Dharma body as compassionate means. This is none other than Amida Tathagata. So Amida Buddha, he says, is form that is arisen out of formlessness. Formless truth and suchness, or fundamental non-discriminative wisdom, arises naturally as compassion, which takes form, okay, as Dharma body's compassion means. This is the meaning of Amida Buddha. Or as he says, compassionate means refers to manifesting form, revealing a name, making itself known to sentient beings. It refers to Amida Buddha. So for Shinran Shonin, formless wisdom, formless suchness and truth arises as form. It takes form It reveals a name to us, Namo Amida Butsu. It reveals itself as Namo Amida Butsu to make itself known to us. Okay, this is Amida Buddha. And this Tathagata, as we saw before, Tathagata is the thus gone, the thus come. This Tathagata, the going and the coming, is also light. Light is none other than wisdom. Wisdom is the form of light. Wisdom is, in addition, formlessness. So Amida Buddha is both name and light. The name Namo Amida Butsu is the illumination of light that illumines all of us. This is the form which Amida Buddha, which formless takes. This is Amida Buddha. We might say then that Mahayana Buddhism finds its consummation, its complete development in Amida Buddha's vows, practice, and enlightenment, whereas other Mahayana paths and Buddhas might require one to practice the six paramita, meditation, or other meritorious acts. The true essence of the Pure Land Way, Jodo Shinshu, makes no requirement that followers engage in practices in order to realize non-discriminative wisdom. All that is required is that one must awaken to the self-awareness, or what one might call the self-manifestation of the great compassion that is Amida Buddha. The Buddha Amitabha, immeasurable light Buddha, Amitayus, immeasurable life Buddha, is the perfect embodiment of complete enlightenment. As the activity of subsequently attained wisdom, Amida Buddha represents the fullest development of true non-discriminative wisdom, the working of compassion in the world of samsara. So Shinran Shonin teaches us that the true teaching practice, shinjin, and realization of the true essence of the Pure Land Way, Jodo Shinshu, is completely given to beings through Amida Buddha's directing of virtue, the aspect of going forth to the Pure Land. So for Shinran Shonin, I believe that the scheme of the path is fundamentally this, that out of formlessness arises form. And it's Amida Buddha, and Amida Buddha directs virtues to us, okay? It gives us the true teaching, practice, shinjin, and realization, which bring about birth. Or I would interpret this to mean that there's a bidirectionality of the path of enlightenment in Shin Buddhism. Even as I aspire for enlightenment and engage the path with utmost sincerity, wholeheartedness, and effort, that's the first green line, the narrow green line. Even as I do, I come to awaken to the reality that my learning, my practice, my faith have not brought about my realization. And even that realization is nothing that I have manufactured. Everything that is authentic and efficacious has been directed to me by Amida Buddha's vow mind. That's the big blue line that I come to realize, that all has been given to me by Amida. And so I believe that Shinran Shonin's teaching of the true essence of the Pure Land Way, Jodo Shinshu, in a sense, kind of recharacterized or reformulated the Pure Land path. Here we see a very similar type of scheme to what we saw before, but now the arrow is going this direction, from the Buddha to us, okay? What is important in this world, in this life, is the moment of shinjin, that upon realizing shinjin, awakening to the unfolding of wisdom as compassion, the working of the vow, one immediately realizes, he says, entry into the ranks of true settlement, attainment of the stage of non-retrogression, realizing the necessary attainment of nirvana, and acquiring the state of attaining the state of the complete equal of complete enlightenment, all in this life. This is how Shinran describes it. And then upon birth in the Pure Land, the land of immeasurable light, after death, one attains complete great nirvana. One attains enlightenment immediately in the Pure Land. I think this is how Shinran Shonin's sort of reformulated scheme of Pure Land Buddhism would be depicted. So all of this lies in the background of his simple statement: the true essence of the Pure Land Way, Jodo Shinshu, is the consummation of Mahayana Buddhism. My hope is that today's talk gives a little bit of insight into sort of the origin, but also the features of Mahayana Buddhism, the development of Pure Land Buddhism, and gives some background into Shinran's a very simple statement but a statement filled with great meaning, great import, and great possibility. So this brings to conclusion part 2, and I'd like to ask all of you to please join me once again in Gassho. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namandam, 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 Namandam. Any questions or comments? If you want to put it in the chat, that's fine, or just want to come out and ask or make a comment to anything at all to sort of bring us together again.
Pete Doctor has raised his hand. Go ahead, Pete.
Okay.
Aloha, Sensei. Thank you. I have a question about processing what you've shared. You know, it's very complex. You're describing these mechanisms of, you know, the Pure Land and these teachings. And at the same time, the most popular writings of Buddhist Dharma and publishing would be, say, the Dalai Lama or Thich Nhat Hanh, which offer a much simpler message, or inspired by the Dharma, you know, still yet in the same. So my question is, would you say that what you're sharing, this very detailed information, for analogy, would be similar to, say, Einstein's theory E = mc², which sounds very simple. Just giving the formula versus Einstein explaining how he got to E = mc². He just, you know, would you say there's some analogy there of, you know, the complexity of what you're saying as opposed to the simplicity of its practice in everyday life? Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. What a great question. I haven't thought about that analogy before, but it's an interesting one. Just to kind of let you know where I was trying to head with this lecture is returning to Shinran's quotation where he says that Jodo Shinshu, the true essence of the Pure Land Way, is the ultimate consummation of Mahayana. And I think he means a number of things by that. One is that in Mahayana, with all its complexity in terms of its logic, was really a very simple teaching that all beings can attain Buddhahood. You know, and so that is, it's a beautiful statement. It's a statement of great clarity and simplicity. I guess when you really get into it, though, a lot of questions arise. But I think for Shinran Shonin, what he was indicating for us is that this great tradition of Mahayana, with all its complexity, is really very clear and very simple. That all beings attain Buddhahood. And he says, this is what Jodo Shinshu is about, is that all beings from all, doesn't matter, you know, where we come from, doesn't matter what our backgrounds might be, doesn't matter our race or ethnicity or gender or political persuasion, that all beings can find themselves embraced within the wisdom and compassion of Amida. And it'd be wonderful to be able to live in that world, and some people can, simply to put their hands together in Gassho and say the Nembutsu. And that's wonderful to be able to live in that world. I guess the task I was given was to try to introduce Mahayana Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, to allow people to gain a sense of both the history, but also the breadth and the depth of this very simple teaching of Jodo Shinshu, that all beings have the capacity, the potential to attain enlightenment, to be born in the Pure Land by awakening to the reality of their being embraced in wisdom, compassion. So I think it's a good, really wonderful question. And I guess probably if using that analogy, I started out trying to explain what E = mc² means, with all of the breaking down of all of the background and all of the the logic and the theory behind it. Whereas, I think Shinran, although he does that, in the letter, what he's really urging his followers to be aware of is, it's that we can simply entrust and say the Nembutsu, okay, and realize birth. And so it's both things. I've often described Buddhism, but in Jodo Shinshu in particular, as being a big tent. It's a place that accommodates all sorts of people who sort of need this sort of theoretical, philosophical, complex approach to religion, but people who simply are rejoice in the Nembutsu, who have learned and been able to walk this path through their friends, through their teachers, through their families, and aspire to be born there, to be together with all their loved ones. Jodo Shinshu accommodates everyone. And I think that's the strength of it. That's the beauty of it. And so, thank you. Thank you for the question. And, what I hope to do is sort of return to those words of Shinran, in which I think he's urging us, simply awaken, simply entrust, and say the Nembutsu. So thank you. That's a great analogy. I hadn't thought about that before.
Okay, next is Hawaii Betsuin. Well, they've raised their hand. So Hawaii Betsuin, please take the mic.
Thank you, Dr. Matsumoto. We have a little watch party going here at the Hawaii Betsuin, about 7 of us here. And during the technological breaks, we were able to have little snacks and discussion. So it was okay for us. But anyway, my question, I was going to ask a question about merit transference in Jodo Shinshu, but I think I'd rather switch to a question. And if you'd care to comment on that, I'd be interested. But I'd rather kind of switch to a question about with MLK Day coming up and MLK activities and participation in the parade, I'm kind of making some connections between Buddhist thought, Jodo Shinshu thought, and some of the themes that emerged in the civil rights movement, and some of the songs too. So I'm wondering, particularly the stage of non-retrogression is kind of interesting to me. I hear echoes of that in for instance, the song sung on the march, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, those kinds of things.
Wow.
If that is, so anyway, maybe your comment on that, but also in MLK's final public speech where he talked about having been to the mountaintop and seen the promised land, and he had no doubt that he said, we as a people will get there. He may not get there with them, but we as a people will get to the promised land. And so I, of course, hear echoes of Pure Land there too. So maybe just interested in your comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, another wonderful question. I really believe personally, and I believe this as one who has sort of been a part of Jodo Shinshu for a number of years. I was a convert to Buddhism and to Jodo Shinshu, like many of you here. And one of the aspects of Buddhism and Shinshu in particular that has attracted me is its fundamental humanity, the fundamental, the sense of unity, the sense of harmony, the sense of tolerance, of respect, for all people, all beings, all life forms. And I think that's very much a core of the Buddhist spirit, the Buddhist worldview. This is, I think, very much in keeping with the civil rights movement, movements of human rights. One of the areas of my great interest is in disability rights, but the area of humanity, of realizing our fundamental humanness and our common humanness, with all of our warts, all of our issues, all of our shortcomings, we can recognize um, this fundamental sense of harmony and respect. I think that this is very, very important every day, but certainly an MLK Day, other days of remembrance. It just, I think we as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists can stand together with other persons, calling for, hoping for, marching for, working for equal rights, for a fundamental sense of just of humanness. And so, yeah, I agree. I think that there's much to be learned, much to be there are many ways in which I think we as Buddhists and as Shin Buddhists can walk together with other beings and other persons in our wish to live lives of freedom, of equality, of respect, of tolerance. I think about this all the time, and one of the issues, of course, we're facing today is the horrible issue of things going on in the Middle East, of the terrible inhumanity, and the fact that we're often forced to choose. We're forced to say, who do you support? Do you support Israel, or do you support the people in Gaza? As if it's an either or. And I think that makes it, if we're convinced that, or if we're told that we have to make a choice, that there's a black and white, then I think that we're just walking down a path that does not lead to true resolution. Shinshu, I think, is a school of Buddhism, of religion, that makes us question that requirement that we have to see things in black and white, or we have to make distinctions between good and bad. It doesn't mean that we don't take stands. It doesn't mean that we don't have beliefs, or we don't feel strongly when we see terrible acts of inhumanity. But I think there's and again, this is maybe getting back to some of that Mahayana Pure Land philosophy of trying to live in a world in which we can transcend our discriminative consciousness, of being able to live in a way and act in a way in which our first tendency is to point fingers and to take sides and to draw comparisons and to paint things in terms of right or wrong, black and white. So anyway, Shinshu, in a way, I think has that perspective. It has that spirit, but it doesn't make it easy. I think it makes things even more difficult in some ways. But what else can we do? I mean, this is the life that we live, and we can't just pretend that we're divorced from those realities. Anyway, thank you for your question. I ended up sort of rambling away here, but
well, thank you very much. And, about non-discrimination, I did jot down during your earlier lecture a potential sign for Monday, which is the wisdom of non-discrimination. So
great.
Reflecting on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
We have a chat question from Reverend Kirihara. And so I put that on the screen. Hope you can see this. It's quite long. The bottom question is that, is there any evidence that Shinran had contact with Christian teachings during his lifetime? And then the introduction to that is about the influence of Christianity.
That's an interesting historical question, Sensei. I don't know of any sort of historical research which has indicated that Shinran was aware of or had any contact with Christian religions or Western religions. There are portions of his writings in which he does discuss other religious or ethical or spiritual traditions. But I haven't seen anything in which he takes on those issues. Having said that, however, it doesn't mean that we living in this world of religious plurality can just take a point of view and say, well, Buddhism has nothing to do with Christianity. I think that's a very that's not a very helpful view. I happen to be a person who believes that in interreligious discussions and conversations and dialogue is very important. Really allows us to gain a deeper sense of the religious traditions and lives of others in the world. It allows us to learn more about sort of these spiritual movements and foundations, and to learn more about the Shin Buddhist tradition as well as share some of our own values, our own perspectives with our friends around the world. And I think it's vitally important. Again, but whether historically Shinran had any contact with Christians, I haven't seen any research that indicates that. Have you? I haven't come upon that at all.
Well, they certainly didn't mention it at the seminary in Kyoto.
Yeah.
Christianity wasn't introduced until quite late in Japan as well.
Right. Yeah, certainly in the area of Nagasaki with the Jesuits and their activity, that was much later than the Kamakura era. So again, Shinran does have something to say about things like kami worship, Confucian thought, and other forms of religious or moral teachings. But again, I haven't seen anything specifically with regard to Christianity.
We're closing in on our 12 o'clock hour. I want to give Dr. Matsumoto a chance for final comments before we close.
Let me just say that I have enjoyed this opportunity to meet with you, even if sporadically. I do want to say how impressed I am by your educational program that you have for this year for your triple celebration. I think it's wonderful, and it really just is set out in a very organized, systematic way. I try to leave the door open for some of my colleagues who are going to be speaking later on when they talk about Shinran's perspective, his teaching practice, Shinjin, and realization. I know all of them. They'll do a fantastic job. And I think if there's an opportunity, I might try to sit in on some of their talks as well. But I wish you all the best. I'm just so grateful to be able to be a part of today's session. And I look forward to opportunities in the future. I'm going to be retiring at the end of June this year. And my hope is that I'll have a little bit more time to do some reading and research and writing, but also a little bit of time to do some traveling to see friends. And so I look forward to seeing you either in Hawaii or the mainland or somewhere in some fashion. And I want to thank you once again for this opportunity today.
Well, thank you, Dr. Matsumoto, for everyone that zoomed in for attending today's lecture, and hopefully we were able to provide some, meaningful, content for you. If you're interested in our organization, if you're visiting, please visit our website, through the QR code, or search for Honpa Hongwanji Mission of Hawaii. And if you have any questions about our triple celebration, please contact us at the link triple celebration at honpahigh.org. Our series is scheduled to be monthly on Saturdays either at 10 a.m. or 2 p.m. Please refer to the flyer for more details. The next lecture is scheduled for Saturday, February 3rd, and then the 17th at 2 p.m. And the lecture will be Professor Mitsuya Dake from Rikoko University. He'll share his presentation about the development of Jodo Shinshu in Japan and Hawaii. And you can use the same Zoom link as today. We'll be sending out a reminder prior to the lectures. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can find various videos at that site. And today's lecture will be posted later after we do some editing. Please consider donating today, either by mail or online. And let us close today's lecture by reading Shinran Shonin's words written in the preface of Jodo Shinshu, which is his master work. How joyous I am, Gotoku Shinran, disciple of Shakyamuni. Rare it is to come upon the sacred scriptures from the westward land of India and the commentaries and masters of China and Japan. But now I've been able to encounter them. Rare it is to hear them, but already I have been able to hear. Reverently entrusting myself to the teaching, practice, and realization that are the true essence of the Pure Land Way, I'm especially aware of the profundity of Tathagata's benevolence. Here I rejoice in what I have heard and extol what I have attained. Shinran Shonin, Jodo Shinshu.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your kind attention and for taking part in today's talk. What is Mahayana Buddhism? What is Pure Land Buddhism? I wish you all the best. I'm very encouraged and very excited about this lecture series that has been developed by the Honpa Hongwanji Mission of Hawaii. I wish you all the best as you continue to engage in this triple celebration, this very auspicious and monumental occasion for all Shin Buddhists. Thank you very much. Please take care. I look forward to seeing you again. Goodbye.
Namo Amida Butsu. Nama. Namanda. Nama.